So when we're looking at a hospital by ownership type, there's really three different types of ownership that we see. The first one is more of your publicly owned hospitals, and these are hospitals that are going to be owned by your state, local, or federal governments. These account for about 22% of hospitals across the United States, and about 70% of those are VA or Veterans Administration hospitals. The second type of ownership that we see are more of your voluntary and community hospitals. We also call these nonprofit, and these account for about 85 to 87% of all hospitals. So when we work to define what is a voluntary or a community hospital, we can think of it as more of these all of these non-federal, short-term, general, and specialty hospitals who their facilities and their services are made available to the public at large. And the last way we can classify a hospital by ownership is proprietary or for-profit. They have their foundation in more physician-owned facilities, and you tend to see more of these in the southern region, while you see more publicly owned hospitals like our federal, state, and locally owned hospitals in the northeastern, more urban regions. Now, when we look at the distribution of the different types of ownership across the United States, we're going to have about 20% classified as a state or local government, and we see most of those kind of out in the middle of the country, and we see some down in the south region. The next type of classification that we look at again is that non-for-profit. We can see the distribution across the United States is about 58.5%. And then the last type, the for-profit, again, we see most of these in the southern region, about 21% of hospitals for distribution. We see these in states more often like Nevada, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico. Tennessee is also a large state that has a large amount of for-profit hospitals, as well as states like Alabama and Florida. Now, when we look at the difference in financing and revenue income between for-profit and non-for-profit hospitals, publicly owned hospitals, they're more dependent on tax-based support and patient revenue. They have a higher percentage of Medicaid patients in their payer mix. When we look at nonprofits, those that have a 501c3 designation, the characteristics we see there in terms of revenue and financing is that these organizations are exempt from paying federal and state taxes. They're exempt from bond financing, and they also are tax-deductible charitable organizations, so you can donate and have a tax write-off, or that these organizations can fund capital without tax dollars. So when we look at the revenue and financing on our for-profit hospitals, these are more investor-driven because they have stockholders that they're beholden to as their primary stakeholder. We saw a big resurgence of these in around the mid-1990s. And we saw a lot of these for-profit hospitals coming in and converting non-for-profit hospitals into for-profit hospitals. So they start to convert more of those charitable assets to community use in the forms of foundations. And they're just becoming more and more common and popular overall because they're simply just more profitable and a more lucrative business to be in. So you'll see a lot more entrepreneurial physicians come in, and they'll refer patients to their own clinic. So think, you might have a ear, nose, and throat physician that may see you at his office and then refer you to a hospital that he owns where he can do the surgery. And be profitable on both ends. Now, we do have some safe harbor regulations that come into play here that give physicians more flexibility to both own the facilities and refer patients to those facilities. So let's look at a couple differences between non-for-profit and for-profit hospitals. So when it comes right down to it, one of the main differences is how we transfer assets, or our right to transfer assets. So in a non-profit hospital, the capital that they have comes from donations, and that's really their source of revenue. Also in a non-profit, when you compare it to a for-profit hospital, in a non-for-profit, you cannot have any type of distribution of dividends or earnings, where in a for-profit you can, and you pay those dividends out to your stockholders. Surplus funds are often restricted for non-for-profit, and there's no real incentives to managers, and we don't see that in for-profit hospitals. We see the opposite. Um, and in non-for-profit hospitals, there are no individual owners that receive any type of proceeds if for some reason the for-profit hospital has to close or if it has to liquidate its assets. So if a hospital dissolves, all the assets go back into the community and not to an individual owner.
I know what days are.